Good morning, everybody, and welcome to this morning's employment law update. And today, Mark and I are going to be talking to you about the future of hybrid working, something that is obviously very relevant to the world of work now. And obviously, since the pandemic, and the monumental shift in home working that was required of those people who were able to work from home, the issue of hybrid working and the way that we work is changing. So that's basically what we're going to be talking about today. And obviously we're going to be looking at some of the employment law implications of hybrid working and just some thoughts and ideas, really, in addition to the legal piece about hybrid working and what hybrid working is, or could be, or might be, or and so on. So, Tim, if you could move us on to the first slide, please. So this is what we're going to be looking at today. So we're going to be looking at why we need to look at hybrid working and why now, really. Is hybrid working here to stay? How does hybrid working sort of dovetail with any flexible working rules that you might already have in place, or perhaps flexible working arrangements that have been made under the flexible working regime? What might any hybrid working, what impact might hybrid working have on pay? And there's lots of sort of examples of different issues that have arisen around pay and hybrid working, and we're going to look at some of those as we go through this. We're also going to be looking at things like compressed working week. And I'm sure many of you as HR professionals will be familiar with some news that's come out around 4-day working week and compressed working weeks. We're going to have a bit of a think about that. We're also going to look at hybrid working policies, so the policy and procedure piece around hybrid working, and then we're going to take some questions at the end of this session, which Mark and I will hopefully deal with. So if we could move to the first slide, or the next slide rather. So what we're going to do is just have a look at, for those delegates, so for our delegates, can you just do a bit of a poll as to whether or not you support hybrid working? Just quick yes or no, and then we'll have a quick look at the results of that. Right, so we can see really quickly that 84% of you support hybrid working and 16% don't. I think what would be really interesting, wouldn't it, and that's obviously beyond the scope of this slide and the session, but I wonder what that might have looked like pre-pandemic. So a bit of a rhetorical question, but you can see that the vast majority of you are supporting long-term hybrid working. So that's really interesting. Probably not that surprising though in the circumstances. If we can move on to the next slide. So why is it important to address hybrid working now? Well, hybrid working has sort of evolved, hasn't it, as a result of, as I said at the beginning of this session, COVID. And I'm sure, like yourselves, when all of the restrictions started to loosen up and change, and we were back in, and then we were all working from home again and back in lockdown again in some sort of way or another, the whole issue around hybrid working just sort of continued to evolve, really. Of course, the longer term implications of people working flexibly is that if the situation, if home working and flexible working, hybrid working, however you want to call it, continues by default, so it's not sort of formalised or a sort of policy wrapping around it, you could end up in a situation, and we've certainly had it with clients, where there'd be discussions around whether or not, in light of the fact that individuals have been working like this for 2 years, there could be an argument to say that actually that right has now become contractual through custom and practice. And so if you need more structure around it, you need to take a bit more control around how hybrid working is going to be dealt with, whether it's going to be a permanent thing or whether it's going to be actually we're still not really sure how this is going to work longer term, so we don't want to completely nail our colours to the post. We just want to keep it under review, keep it sort of temporary in nature, and actually have a bit more rules around it, rather than employers just saying, oh, actually I'm just going to work from home Monday to Thursday and I might come in on a Friday. Our view is that you actually need to take some control around this and look at mitigating your risk if you don't want the situation, as I said, to effectively become implied into individuals' contracts of employment. So, I mean, from our perspective and from talking to clients, I'm not sure that we're fully there on this journey of the change in working practices. I wonder whether, you know, if you think about it on a sort of a bit of a circle or a bit of a graph, I'm not quite sure that we're sort of fully where we might end up being ultimately. And it may well be that things will just continue to evolve, things will change, decisions might be made around premises, all of those sorts of things. But because of those sorts of longer term decisions, you might not necessarily want not a free-for-all hybrid working situation, but you might want a bit of structure around it and give yourselves wiggle room if things change and evolve going forward that perhaps you haven't foreseen at this stage. And you know, goodness, nobody really foresaw COVID coming and the massive impact it had on the working environment. So I think that's why it's important to address it at the moment. Can we go on to the next slide? Mark, I think you're taking this one, aren't you?
Yes, thanks very much, Alison. I saw that that 50% of everybody who was on a payroll during the pandemic, 50% of those people were working from home during the COVID period. So that's a significant number. But as Alison says, we're 2 years from that position. There'll be people who are now starting with their employer, joining an organisation which has had some working from home, perhaps some employees working from home, or all employees working from home during the COVID period. We're out of that period now. It's thinking about what approach do we want going forward, and the benefit, as Alison says, of putting something in place, a structure, a framework in place, is that you can head off at the pass some of those arguments from people saying, well, look, I've got this implied right to work in the way that I think best fits. As this slide explains, there's lots of thinking going on about this particular area, lots of analysis, and the ONS have produced a detailed report, a survey of workers in the UK in order to understand people's thoughts about working from home, about their perspectives of the hybrid workplace. 84% of those people who had to work from home during the pandemic say they now plan to hybrid work, and I think that's a huge indication that the days of expecting all employees to be physically in work during work hours is just not fitting with the expectations of the modern workforce. 42% of hybrid workers plan to work mostly from home and sometimes from the office. And the rest of the statistics sort of report some of the benefits that staff have identified in terms of working from home, hybrid working, with references, quite a significant amount, talking about an improved work-life balance, 52% saying that they complete work quicker at home, so they're more effective at home, with 53% identifying fewer distractions at home, and 47% reporting improved well-being. There are other surveys out there, and I found an interesting one from Google, which was a sort of worldwide analysis, and some of the statistics in that were actually quite interesting and in a way contrary to some of the findings of this ONS report. I saw that 57% of the respondents felt that they were more disconnected from their workplace as a consequence of hybrid working, with 62% saying that they were concerned that their career would be impacted detrimentally because they were working from home and had less opportunity to network with colleagues. And 54% said that the limited social interactions as a result of working from home had a negative impact on their mental health. So, and I think one of the conclusions that you can draw from these statistics and the statistics from the ONS is there's unlikely to be a one-size-fits-all approach in relation to hybrid working. And whilst there are clearly advantages that come out of the ONS study, there's going to be a need for employers to really think about how they are maintaining those workplace interactions that people are identifying as being really important. Tamar, if we could go on to the next slide, please. So I've touched upon some of the benefits and certainly the challenges for employers already, but I think in answer to the question on the slide, is hybrid working here to stay? The answer is yes. I think absolutely. I think that it's clearly something that employees are now going to value and are likely to look for as part of any recruitment process. There are benefits for employers. Many employers will be looking at their office space, their physical environment, whether it's a building that they own or they're renting, looking at the space that they need. Is there an opportunity to remove rows and rows of desks and sort of cubicles from an office environment and turn the office space into more of a sort of breakout area where there's meeting space and place for clients to visit, to attend those meetings? I think there's significant opportunities to look at head count, look at the number of people who are using a physical office environment or place of work, and look at reducing the significant costs that come from that. There's a bullet point here. The next is about increased productivity, motivation, and staff retention. Now, some of that is coming from the ONS survey, but again, I think it's going to be really important for each employer to grapple with the question of productivity for itself. How is that being measured? What does that actually mean in terms of, is it delivery to clients? Is it the bottom line, the numbers on the balance sheet? That's going to really be a case by case analysis. But the indication is that for many organizations, productivity has not reduced as a consequence of the move to hybrid working and working from home. Motivation, I think motivation is a bit of a double-edged point. As I've mentioned, there are clearly some staff who will be motivated by the opportunity to have better work-life balance, perhaps spend more time within the sort of family environment, and that will motivate staff. It may not motivate everybody in the same way. Staff retention, again, what works for one person may not work for another, but I think it's likely that having a flexible approach to hybrid working is going to be something that staff value and new joiners look for as part of their consideration as to who to work for in the future. Geographical flexibility. Well, this is interesting, I suppose. It's about thinking about where people are based. You know, if people are working all from a particular location, whether it's in a different part of the city or further afield, can you think about, you know, creating a sort of hub environment within that location where a group of employees can meet, interact without trekking all the way into the city centre or heading to an office that is outside of the city or wherever it might be. There's much more flexibility for that, and perhaps there's an opportunity to you know, in a client-facing business, embrace that and allow people to, you know, live and work closer to a particular client or group of clients. Challenges for employers, well, clearly there are a lot. Everybody, when I speak to them about hybrid working, is concerned about the risk to the team. How is teamwork encouraged? We've all got very used to speaking over Zoom and Teams and other remote video conferencing facilities. They're great. The technology is clearly there and it works, but is it the same as being in the same room as your colleague and allowing water cooler conversations to take place? I think it's very hard to say that it is the same. You know, organizational culture, how is that protected? How is that maintained, where you have people working in a more fragmented way, potentially, you know, without everybody being in the office at the same time on the same days? How does that work in sort of organizing maybe even sort of social events around people's attendance at work? I think it just means a greater degree of planning and thought needs to go into those sorts of arrangements. Collaboration, innovation, those are things that are often sparked by face-to-face conversations, not always, but it's certainly, I think, helpful for people to be physically in the same environment in order for sort of internal meetings to take place, for those water cooler conversations to occur, as I've mentioned. Management and supervision of colleagues, I think it's always going to be an issue for perhaps more junior staff who are looking to receive mentoring, on the job training, as to how that happens within a hybrid working environment. How do you ensure that people are getting the support that they need from more senior colleagues, that they're having an opportunity to join meetings, listen in on conversations, to experience that input that is really necessary to build the career. And I do think that is something that has been flagged around the impact of sort of networking within an environment where lots and lots of people are working from home for a lot of the week. And finally, and I do think this is an important factor, I mean, clearly the position is better than it may have been during the pandemic. We are now not by law required to remain in our homes, and therefore there is the opportunity to have social interactions. But you know, there's inevitably a risk of staff becoming lonely, becoming bored, disincentivized by just spending a lot of time within their home environment, perhaps sat in front of a laptop, can feel quite isolating. And I think it's going to be a challenge for employers as to how it can they can overcome that, how they can ensure that the individuals do feel involved in decision making, and that they're not simply just plugging into a laptop at 9 o'clock in the morning and logging off at 5 p.m. but they are involved in a team, and there's everybody pulling in the same direction. If we move to the next slide, Alison's going to talk about some of the legal issues around flexible working.
Thank you, Mark. Can I just check you can hear me again, because I've muted you? Right, Mark's nodding. Great, thank you, Mark. So obviously, we already, I mean, pre-pandemic, we were probably all very familiar with the rules around making a flexible working request, and therefore sort of having a hybrid working policy will sit outside of that, and there are advantages for doing that, and one of those advantages really is to ensure that you've got sufficient flexibility to keep things under review, because as I sort of alluded to earlier, things are changing, things are continuing to change, and I don't think that we are at a place where it's the final destination, if you like, in terms of the world of work and how we work, where we work. And interestingly, I know that I said that I'd cover questions at the end, but whilst Mark was talking, and of course I was listening to everything that you were saying, Mark, but I had a look at one of the comments, and one of the comments in the box was around measuring productivity. And so whilst the statistics are telling us one thing around productivity, and that productivity has to date not been an issue, notwithstanding hybrid working, that's not to say that things might change, or that there is an issue for your organisation or in certain departments in your organisation where productivity does actually become a bit of an issue for a number of factors. But you know, if there's a group of individuals who perhaps need better oversight, I suppose is one way of looking at it, when they're working remotely. So you know, just linking that to this slide, it is around having a policy that allows you to flex, change, obviously keep employees on board, but isn't the permanent variation that a flexible work request has. So in theory, having an organisation-wide hybrid policy allows you to amend your approach to hybrid working according to your needs, which may change. Businesses evolve, COVID is evolving, who knows if what the situation is going to be this autumn, winter. Fingers crossed we're not going into another lockdown. And it's easy, depending on how you negotiate changes, but hopefully that would be easily agreed and will amount to a temporary change. But where staff want to depart from your policy or formalise their hybrid working arrangements, then you might flip back into the flexible working request, and that's what might be necessary. So that's always something to think through. Obviously, you're going to have your organisation-wide policy if that's what you decide is the best thing for you to do, but you do always also need to think about individual circumstances and whether in considering those, actually it would be better to deal with it under a more formal flexible working request and under that regime. And don't forget that that then becomes a permanent variation of their contracting employment. So again, you might want to put some trial periods in that, or you might want to have it as a temporary change with a review and all of those sorts of things. So just think a little bit out of the box in terms of how you're going to deal with things. Tim, can I have the next slide, please? Okay, so what is interesting is that the government have looked at, obviously as a result of COVID and the changes to the workplace, consultation has taken place on updating the flexible working regime and further extending it, if you like. But interestingly, that wasn't included in the Queen's speech, and I think we kind of expected it to be there, and it was one for employment lawyers who follow these things. It was a bit of a surprise because we felt that that seemed to be the direction of travel, and without being political, perhaps that might not be so much the direction of travel, Freudian slip, with this particular government. So interesting, possibly it would be good to keep an eye on it just to see whether or not things change. The current position, of course, is that all qualifying employees have the right to request flexible working under the statutory scheme. And of course, flexible working could involve a change to working hours, the working times or place of work, or a combination of all of these things. So you can see quite easily how that sort of sits or is very similar to sort of hybrid working type arrangements. But again, as I said, that's a permanent variation. In order to be a qualifying employee, you must have at least 26 weeks service at the date of request, and you can only make one request per 12-month period, and agency workers currently can't make a request. So just a useful reminder about flexible working. And if we can just flip onto the next slide, please, Tamar. And again, just a bit of a reminder in terms of what the flexible working rules are. So you have to give a decision within 3 months of the request. I sometimes think that employers forget about the time issues around the flexible working request regime. So it's something just to bear in mind. Things sometimes get a little bit lost in the ether when managers are thinking through a flexible working request. So it's just important to keep an eye on that 3-month period. And then we've just listed the 8 specific grounds for refusal. Don't forget that even though you can rely on one of these specific grounds for refusal, that doesn't necessarily mean that in some way prevents an individual from bringing a claim for example, a type of discrimination type claim. So you would have to be able to justify why it is that you rely on that ground for refusal, and whether for a discrimination type claim, whether that is a proportionate means of achieving a legitimate aim, and that's sort of a discrimination objective justification test. Traditionally, sort of when I started working as an employment lawyer a little time ago, the sorts of refusals and the risk would be traditionally around sex discrimination and request to work part-time, usually from mothers returning from maternity leave. But I think over the years that's sort of evolving and changing, where we're looking at an aging population, people having different pools on their time and different sorts of responsibilities. So again, worth thinking through as to whether or not you can justify actually one of those grounds for refusal for a flexible working request. Don't forget, you've got a right of appeal, and in terms of refusing a request, in addition to the discrimination bits that I've just spoken to, it's going to be more challenging, isn't it, to reject a request where remote working has been possible and has been proven to have worked as a result of obviously COVID and the changes to the workplace. So think that through in terms of whether or not you can legitimately refuse a request where it's been shown to work or it's working in other parts of the business. Okay, so if we move on to the next slide. Mark, I think this one's for you.
Yes, thank you very much, Alison. So pay considerations, there's there was something in the news fairly recently. I think it got quite a lot of coverage on the BBC news website, involving a law firm that London based had decided that its staff could elect to continue to work from home. They could work from home 5 days a week if they wished, but the salary that they would be paid would be reduced by 20% if they did ask to work from home for that entire period of time. So the example in the BBC website was that a lawyer earning £90,000 a year would have their salary reduced to £72,000 a year. I think a pretty significant drop. 20% of salary effectively means you're reducing what would have been a 5-day week to a 4-day week in terms of pay. So it's really interesting to see that direction of travel, and I suppose thinking about that balance, thinking about the value that employees place on working from home, and is that value for those employees of that particular law firm effectively 1/5 of their salary. I think there is some sense behind that sort of analysis and consideration, particularly in London, where London weighting is a factor that's taken into account with salary. Well, if it's no longer the case that an employee is perhaps required to work in London, work close to their perhaps central London office, to live close to their central London office and work there on a day-to-day basis, perhaps it does make some sense that there's a significant saving in terms of commuting that is taking place. Equally, there are likely to be some potentially cost of living savings that can be made if an employee relocates. So there are certainly considerations, and I think reasonable considerations, that employers can have in relation to the salary that staff receive. The tricky thing is running any sort of process that results in the reduction of pay. Easy for new staff. New staff can be recruited at whatever benefits, whatever salary the employer identifies is reasonable to pay them. They'll take into account the usual considerations. I suppose obviously market forces are going to be relevant here, but I can see that employers could be offering jobs which are entirely remote working based, or perhaps a sort of hybrid model of some kind, and with perhaps a different salary to that is offered to staff who are committing to working on a full-time basis. Reducing the salary of existing staff to create that situation is very difficult. In practice, you're talking about a consultation process. You're changing the terms and conditions of employment, and you're changing the salary that an employee receives. It's pretty significant, probably the most significant term and condition of employment. Generally, you'll look for agreement with staff for that change. If agreement is not possible after that consultation process, then you're in the world of thinking about terminating and re-engaging the employees. Perfectly lawful to do that once consultation has taken place and you've got a sound business reason for the proposed change. But nevertheless, that process and the decision to terminate and offer re-engagement can sometimes get a bad press, and does have, by its very nature, the risk of demotivating staff who will be concerned about losing their jobs and being engaged on different T's and C's. So there are risks of claims. Obvious claim is unfair dismissal or terminating employment at the end of this process. There's also potentially some discrimination aspect to this. If you're creating a sort of one-size-fits-all approach, requiring people to take a lower salary in order to work from home, that may disproportionately impact on those people who working from home benefits as a consequence of childcare arrangements or their particular health circumstances and illness perhaps that they have, or medical condition which which makes it more difficult for them to attend work on a full-time basis. So all in all, reducing the salary of existing staff is not going to be straightforward, but it's certainly not impossible. You'd want a careful consideration of the business reasons for doing that, business reasons behind changing terms and conditions, and then thinking about the way the consultation process will work. If we go on to the next slide, Tamar, that Alison's already mentioned this. This is really interesting, and it's getting, as Allison mentioned, quite a lot of press at the moment. Different perspectives. The compressed working week, not a new phenomenon, not a new idea, but it's now being sort of badged as this 4-day week. And the thinking behind it is that employees agree to work for 80% of the time for 100% of their pay, and at the same time commit to 100% productivity. The actual way this is framed is it's 100, 80, 100. So this is something that apparently has been trialed quite significantly in I think Iceland, I think the Republic of Ireland. A number of companies have looked at it. There's an organisation called the 4-Day Week Global, which has a website. There is a link on this slide. It's well worth just clicking on it to see to see some case studies that they have on that website if you're interested. Apparently, it's worked very well for the organisations that have signed up to it. There have been some of the case studies that I read on the website talk about an increased productivity, that the workers who are signed up to this work very, very hard during the 4 days that they are saying that they will work, on the understanding, with the incentive of knowing that they effectively have a 3-day weekend, or that extra day in what would have otherwise been the working week. That said, again, it's unlikely to be a solution perhaps for every organisation. There may be questions around how that productivity is managed, particularly where there is a sort of client-facing aspect to the role. And it may actually be the case that it's not helpful for employees to have to do 100% of their work over 4 days, particularly where they have childcare responsibilities 5 days a week, well, 7 days a week. It may be that you're turning what would have been a 40-hour week over 5 days into a 40-hour week over 4 days, which may make it very hard indeed for employees to juggle their other commitments on those 4 days. So it's as I say, something that's not that's not necessarily going to be a one-size-fits-all approach, but it is potentially worth reflecting on. The academic analysis apparently supports the idea that people are more effective over a shorter working period. And the person behind this website, the 4-Day Week Global, somebody called Andrew Barnes, and he's based in New Zealand. And I read about his business, which is called Perpetual Guardian, and they manage wills and trusts. And he approached his employees back in 2018 with this idea, and their whole approach was just really focused on how to reduce non-working distractions during a working week. So his business, they've I was reading, set up an arrangement where each employee has a locker, and they put their mobile phone in there at the beginning of every day. They don't get it out until the end of the day. So they have shorter meetings or no meetings at all during the working week, and have a system where they put a flag on their desk if they wanted to tell their colleagues that they did not want to be disturbed. So I think the idea is that it's, if you're working, you are working on the understanding then that you've got that extra day when you can do as you wish and spend as much time on your mobile phone as you might want. Of course, it can't be overlooked, and this is the final point, that there are already staff who work 4 days a week, or perhaps fewer, for less pay, and that really is going to take some careful consideration. Do those employees then work 3 days a week for the pay that they're currently receiving? I'm afraid there's no straightforward and immediate answer, save that, again, it's going to take careful analysis and consultation with employees to find the right approach. That was everything I had to say on the 4-day week. So Tamara, over to you to get on to the next slide, please. I think the final point is just to talk about the benefits to having some form of policy in place to all of this. There's a as always with many employment law issues, it's really important to be transparent, and I think having that policy in place allows organisations to set a framework and maintain consistency in terms of the way that employees are treated, what they can expect around opportunities to work from home, and what formal policies there are elsewhere, perhaps within an employee handbook, such as the flexible working policy, which allow people to make requests if their current arrangements are not working for them in any particular way. As the bullet point mentions, non-contractual, and I think this is a question that came from somebody in the Q&A or in the chat. You know, it's important that that policy is non-contractual. It doesn't form part of the contractual terms and conditions of employment that the employee works under. So that means it can be changed. You don't need to get involved in a detailed and lengthy consultation process with employees in order to agree changes to a non-contractual policy. You would need to tell people when the policy is changing, but you don't need them to expressly agree to that change. So go to the next slide, please. I think that this slide speaks for itself in terms of what you might need to think about including within that policy. There's obviously a need to think about eligibility for hybrid working. Is it everybody? Is it certain roles, whether it's seniority, or is it that there are certain jobs which we just need to be done in person, cannot be done remotely? Is there a ideal split between the workplace and home working? Is it 3 days a week in work, 2 days a week working from home, or vice versa? Is there a need to be so specific and detailed about that? How much do we leave to employees' discretion? How much do we leave to individual teams to work out what works for them or doesn't do? There may be, inevitably, there will be sometimes when you'll want in-person attendance at certain events, whether it's a AGM or monthly meetings that might take place, or specific tasks, or a requirement that somebody meets with a particular client or supplier at a certain stage. And finally, I think there's a consideration about what is meant when we talk about remote working. Are we talking about somebody working from home, or are we talking about perhaps a wider arrangement where somebody can work from wherever their laptop is and their mobile phone is, and secure internet connection? Does that include working abroad, outside of the jurisdiction of England and Wales? There's probably some good reasons to take care around making that arrangement, setting that in stone. There may well be local laws that apply to employees working remotely, which is worth spending some time thinking through. And how do you manage the confidentiality issues that come out of working from home? Is it a shared living space that somebody has? How are they maintaining the confidentiality of their telephone calls, paperwork that they might be required to print, or files that they might be required to store or keep on their home premises? And there are lots of data protection implications of that as well. How do we keep personal data secure. Obviously really important for complying with the GDPR. And if somebody is working abroad, then there's a question again about whether they are transferring personal data outside of the jurisdiction. Again, a really important consideration for data protection legislation. On to the next slide, please. So I think then the final points, I think a few of these have come up in the Q&A. The hybrid working policy is going to need to think about when this will all be kept under review. Is there a frequent review period that is built into it? When might it be revoked? When might it not be considered suitable? It may be that there are some people who it doesn't apply to, the trainees or people in specific training roles. What equipment will be provided? There was a question, I think, early on about how health and safety obligations that an employer is subject to are dealt with. I think the key thing here is to remember that the employer is responsible for the health and safety of its staff, including those who are working from home. So the more that can be done to check that employees have the right equipment, the right desk, the right seat or chair, the better, the stronger the position will be for the employer to then defend any potential health and safety claim. That might include a visit to somebody's house. It might include a video call to make sure that they've got the right equipment, the right stuff around them, or it might be as simple as just getting somebody to sign something to agree that they're working safely. How will office working be managed? It's probable that for most employers it doesn't need to be as dealt with in such minute detail as during a COVID period of time, when you were thinking about directions of travel and how to minimize physical contact between staff. But there'll still need to be some consideration to make sure that whatever office space is perhaps available is being dealt with efficiently, and you're not having too many people turning up for however much desk space you have. You're thinking about things like dress code. Are staff now aware of the need to return to formal workwear when in the office environment, and equally when working from home? And finally, the key point, I think, is to remember that flexible working policy is still important. That flexible working request right is there to those employees who are eligible for it, as Alison mentions, and to not necessarily overlook that. If we can go to the next slide, please.
Do you want me to just pick? I'll just do this. Thank
please,
you very much. Mark has obviously been keeping a beady eye on the questions and the chat, as have I. But before we deal with some of those questions, to the extent that Mark hasn't just covered those off, I just wanted to flag for your attention the HR and Employment Law for Managers, which is an online training tool that we've developed as a team, and includes 9 short courses covering key legal areas. So those are on the slide. Anything from conducting a disciplinary hearing, holding a protected conversation, right the way through to the right to work checks, which is relevant because one of the queries is around right to work and virtual right to work checks. So those are available to you, and the costing details is on the slide. If you are interested in that, and one of our team can give you a bell, please just quickly complete this poll, and then Mark and I will just touch on some of the questions and some of the issues that have been raised in the chat box. One thing that was raised as a bit of a theme is sort of the differences between the cost of travelling into work and all of those commuting costs that we just sort of absorbed without question really prior to the pandemic, and then obviously the costs of heating your home in order to work from home, and sort of the changes that are currently going on, I suppose, is sort of consistent with some of the cost of living issues that we're currently facing. These are all things that, I mean, if you're going to take away waiting allowances and things like that, those are all things that you do need to think through and challenge yourselves as to whether it's appropriate in the circumstances and what that allowance looks like. And does actually a London waiting allowance, for argument's sake, actually cover just the travel costs of travelling to and from London, or does it also encompass the increased living costs of working and operating in London? So for some employers that might be quite tricky to sort of drill down into, but it's those sorts of things that you do need to consider. And as you've rightly said, you know, the cost of heating your home is just another factor. And actually, you know, as I said at the beginning of this, you know, the cost of heating your home was a lot less than it was this time last year. And so to the extent that people might be happy to put the heating on whilst they're working from home, they might be less inclined to do so going forward, and that might push more people back into the workplace. So not an answer to the question, but sort of a discussion around that. There was also an interesting comment around waiting allowances where people are coming in part of the week. And again, I would just go back to thinking about what those allowances were for. If I just, some of the questions are in the chat and some are in the Q&A. So I'm going to deal with, I think Mark has dealt with some of the bits around the health and safety, your duty to ensure a safe place of work. And again, that really goes down to your duty to get, well, the way that you can show that is that you carry out health and safety risk assessments. So you need to be satisfied that what you're doing is sufficient for those purposes. I think I've dealt with this. Can you send around the presentation? Someone said. I think probably we can. I will need to check with the powers.
Yeah, it will be shared.
Fine. Okay. Thank you, Mark. I've got the cost of living bit, the cost of living piece. One of you put an interesting question around, did anybody know about carrying out right to work checks, the identity service provider? The answer to that is I don't know, but if anybody out there does know, then please just pop a comment in the chat box or in the answer Q&A box. I was under the one question that's come in is I was understanding that a flexible working request can commence on the joining date. No, it's still the case. It's 26 weeks. The government's one of their proposals was to make it a day one right, but as I said, that wasn't included in the Queen's speech. So we're still there. There was some interesting conversations, some interesting comments around productivity and client-facing roles, and whether or not productivity is a problem, is a challenge. And I suppose, to be honest, that will depend on a case-by-case basis, depending on what sector and what organisation you work in, and the metrics around measuring productivity. Of course, there are always going to be pockets where productivity may be a challenge. And I would suggest that, you know, whilst we get all of these statistics around productivity, it's always good to challenge yourself to see whether or not that is actually the case in your organisation. I mean, from our perspective, it's very easy to look at productivity because of the way that we work and the way that we are measured. So it's not such a problem. I'm just going through this. Start with that.
I think there are a couple of questions about the extent to which somebody can be sort of compelled to return to the sort of office environment, and whether that's a reasonable management instruction. And I'm afraid there's unlikely to be a hard and fast rule or answer here. I mean, ultimately, you'd start by looking at what's in the contract, what the contract of employment says about the place of work. and think about then seeking to say that it's a reasonable instruction to require somebody to return to that place to perform their duties. The issue that you have though is, is it reasonable? And reasonableness in this situation is going to depend on that individual employee's situation, I would imagine, to an extent.
I think to an extent, I think that, sorry to talk over you, I think to an extent it will be an objective and subjective test, won't it? But the answer, frustratingly, I think is it depends. But I take the view that if you ask somebody to come into the office because you have a legitimate reason for them to do that, then they should be expected to come in. And I think you need to be quite clear about what the rationale is for that. I think the other piece to this is, and we've had some work done around, what is it about the workplace that people are concerned about? Is it work-life balance? And do we need to be thinking about making the workplace a more conducive place to be, to get people back? So how can we make it a more attractive workspace? Do we need to think about other things that would encourage people to come back in? And some of you might sort of do an internal eye roll about that, but that's certainly what some of the evidence is showing, actually, around encouraging people back in. Interestingly, in fact, one of the delegates online has sort of alluded to this and talked in the chat box about increased flexible working requests and sort of thinking about how we look to encourage people back and seeing the big picture. And I completely agree with that. And for our young people as well, who probably need a little bit more supervision and guidance and help for them to develop in their career. It's okay for people like us who've been doing this for a little while, but for our young people and our graduates, I personally feel that it's really important to bring them on and supervise and manage them properly, and I think it's harder when you're doing that remotely. Mark, I don't know if you've got anything else to add.
No, just to say I totally agree, and I think that there's some really interesting views that have been shared in the chat, and apologies if we haven't specifically been able to respond to each of them, but it's clear that there are probably different views, different approaches, and as I've said, I really think this is an area where there's unlikely to be a one-size-fits-all approach that you can just adopt across the entire organization. You need to think carefully about the subjective issues, individuals' own personal preferences and personal, as Alison says, the point that they are in their career, really big consideration.